It was one of the most chilling maritime mysteries of the Cold War. The USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered American submarine, vanished in the Atlantic Ocean, taking 99 sailors with it. The official story? A mechanical failure? A tragic accident? End of story. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if the real reason for the Scorpion's disappearance was hidden, not just to avoid blame, but to cover up a secret so dangerous it could have triggered war? Newly declassified documents began to tell a different story, a much darker one. The Scorpion was on its way home from a mission in the Mediterranean. It was a skipjack-class nuclear submarine, sleek, silent, and deadly, one of the fastest attack subs in the U.S. Navy's fleet. With its mission complete, it was headed back to Norfolk, Virginia. On board, 99 men, tired but relieved. There was an air of calm. It had been a routine deployment. Everyone expected to be home in a few days. No one knew they were hours from disaster. According to protocol, subs like the Scorpion had to check in regularly, sending brief, encrypted position updates just to confirm everything was okay. But that night, the Scorpion missed a scheduled check-in. At first, no one panicked. Communication lapses happened. Equipment could glitch. Sometimes it was just weather interference. The Navy told families not to worry. They publicly suggested that the Scorpion was simply delayed. The crew was expected to arrive in Norfolk soon. But behind closed doors, alarm bells were already ringing. Inside the Atlantic Submarine Force Command Center, officers weren't buying the delay. The Scorpion's silence didn't fit the profile of a minor glitch. Something was very wrong, and the Navy knew it. They quietly upgraded the situation to a full-blown emergency. The worry wasn't just mechanical failure anymore. The top brass feared something much worse. The U.S. Navy launched a massive search operation. Destroyers, frigates, aircraft, and rescue vessels were dispatched across a huge area of the Atlantic. News coverage showed an all-out effort to locate the missing sub. But the truth? The Navy already knew it wasn't a rescue mission. Their secret weapon was already telling them the answer. That weapon was SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, a top-secret network of hydrophones hidden on the ocean floor. It was originally designed to detect Soviet submarines during the Cold War, but that night it picked up something else entirely. What SOSUS recorded was chilling. First, a deep, low-frequency explosion. Then, moments later, a second, heavier sound, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a submarine hull collapsing under intense ocean pressure. To the trained ears of Navy analysts, the meaning was clear. Somewhere in the dark Atlantic, a submarine had suffered a catastrophic implosion. And the location? Just where the Scorpion was supposed to be. There was no question anymore. The Scorpion hadn't just gone silent. It had been destroyed. Instantly. Inside secure Navy intelligence rooms, the analysis of those SOSUS recordings began immediately, and what they found disturbed even the most experienced officers. This wasn't just a technical failure. The sequence of sounds was wrong. The first acoustic event wasn't the implosion, it was something else, an explosion. That suggested something hit the Scorpion before it collapsed. An external force, maybe a torpedo. This was not something that could be explained away as a battery fire or a mechanical error. The acoustic data pointed to an attack, but the SOSUS network itself was classified. Even mentioning it would expose its existence, and that was unacceptable. So instead, the Navy told the public the Scorpion was missing. Families were told to keep hoping, and when the sub didn't show, the Navy officially declared the Scorpion submiss. Submarine missing. But in truth, they already knew there would be no survivors. The Navy convened a formal court of inquiry. To outsiders, it looked like a serious official investigation. 70 witnesses, hundreds of pages of technical reports. Experts in submarines, sonar, engineering, all brought together to find out what happened. But the inquiry barely mentioned the SOSUS data. And when it did, it used such vague language that the meaning was completely obscured. The most important evidence was left out. The people at the top already knew the truth. They'd seen the recordings. They knew a Soviet sub had been detected near the Scorpion's last known position. They knew the pattern of damage didn't fit an internal accident. But they also knew that admitting the Scorpion had been sunk by hostile action could mean one thing: war. The Cold War was already balanced on a knife's edge. If the U.S. accused the Soviet Union of attacking and sinking a nuclear submarine, the response would have to be military. And that could escalate, fast. So the Navy made a decision: suppress the truth. The official conclusion of the inquiry? Inconclusive. Theories included a mechanical failure, accidental torpedo detonation, maybe even flooding. But no theory was confirmed. No cause was identified. The truth was buried under careful language and red tape. The records were sealed, and families got no real answers, only technical jargon and speculation. The Navy later announced they had found the wreck. It was almost 10,000 feet down, resting on the ocean floor. Photos were released: twisted metal, broken sections of the hull. The public was told this was the tragic end of the mystery. A mechanical failure, a solemn conclusion. But what they weren't told was that the Navy had found the wreck much earlier. Internal documents revealed that ships like the USS Compass Island and USS Petrel had actually pinpointed the location months before. Why the delay in going public? Because what they saw at the bottom of the ocean didn't match their official story. Parts of the hull were damaged in ways that didn't match an implosion from internal failure. Instead, it looked like sections had been blown outward by an external blast. There were signs of a violent event before the pressure collapse. Something had happened to the Scorpion, something explosive, and those details never shared. Because admitting them would be admitting that something, or someone, attacked the submarine. And that was a truth too dangerous to say out loud. The Navy's decision to keep silent wasn't just about embarrassment or technical mystery. It was about avoiding global disaster. If the Scorpion had indeed been attacked, and the attacker was a Soviet submarine, the implications were massive. That kind of aggression, especially during the height of Cold War paranoia, would have demanded a response, possibly even retaliation. Admitting it could have meant war. So the Navy's leadership faced a brutal choice: pursue the truth and risk nuclear escalation, or bury the truth to preserve an uneasy peace. They chose secrecy, and that secrecy came at a cost, not just to the truth, but to the families of the 99 lost sailors. They weren't just mourning their loved ones. They were left in the dark, denied even the basic dignity of knowing how or why their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons had died. Instead, they were handed a sanitized version of the story, a version designed to protect political strategy, not provide answers. In the decades that followed, the silence surrounding the USS Scorpion became deafening, and where official explanations were vague, alternative theories began to multiply. The Navy's go-to answer remained mechanical failure, battery explosion perhaps, or a fire in the torpedo room, maybe a critical system malfunction. All plausible in theory. Submarines are complex. A single small issue can cascade into disaster, but these explanations never sat right with many former sailors, historians, and even high-ranking naval officers. They'd seen the wreckage. They'd studied the photographs and read the internal memos, some of which were quietly leaked over the years. The damage to the Scorpion didn't look like the result of pressure crushing a failing sub from the inside. It looked like something struck it, something from outside, something with force. One retired sonar technician described the damage as inconsistent with internal failure. Parts of the hull were bent outward instead of inward. A torpedo strike, perhaps? Or a mine? The signs were there. And so, an alternate theory gained traction, that the Scorpion wasn't lost to accident, but to attack. What made this theory all the more disturbing was what else was happening at the time. The Scorpion's last known position wasn't just randomly remote. It was an area of the Atlantic that was buzzing with Soviet naval activity. Submarines from both nations were playing high-stakes cat-and-mouse games beneath the surface. We now know that a Soviet submarine had, in fact, been detected near the Scorpion's path during that time. SOSUS picked up something, possibly a Soviet vessel maneuvering suspiciously close, and more than that, the hydrophones picked up two distinct acoustic events that night, an explosion and then, moments later, the Scorpion's implosion. Some analysts believed that first explosion was the sound of a torpedo, fired from outside, striking the hull and ending everything in seconds. There were even reports, whispered within intelligence circles, that a Soviet sub was seen fleeing the area shortly after the event. But none of that ever made it into the official story. Inside the Pentagon, things were anything but calm. Newly released documents show that the days following the Scorpion's disappearance were filled with high-level meetings and fierce internal debate. Should the U.S. accuse the Soviet Union? Should it respond? What if it provoked a full-scale war? The answer was unanimous. It couldn't. Not in that moment. Not with tensions already sky-high over Vietnam, nuclear proliferation, and espionage cases back home. So, the leadership made a calculated decision. Suppress the evidence. Control the narrative. Let the Scorpion become a mystery rather than a spark. That meant classifying reports, silencing witnesses, and ignoring the mounting inconsistencies. The inquiry was steered away from anything that hinted at attack. Naval officers who raised uncomfortable questions were discouraged from pursuing them. And so the legacy of the Scorpion became one of doubt, not closure. But time has a way of loosening lips. Cold War documents slowly started being released, and some veterans who had held their silence for decades began to speak out. Two former Navy radio operators who served at the Atlantic Submarine Forces Communications Center in Norfolk during the Scorpion's final days were among the first to go public. What they shared shook the foundation of the official story. They described the night the Scorpion missed its check-in. It wasn't treated like a routine error. Inside the command center, panic spread quickly. Senior officers flooded the room. Urgent communications were sent. This was no normal delay. But what really stayed with them wasn't just the tension. It was what followed. They recalled intercepted messages referencing an unidentified foreign submarine operating dangerously close to the Scorpion's position, just before it vanished. They remembered coded transmissions, priority orders, and sudden radio silence. They were told to say nothing, and for over 40 years they didn't. But as files were slowly declassified and more veterans began asking questions, they felt it was time. Their accounts lined up with what had long been suspected by insiders. The Scorpion hadn't just malfunctioned. It had been targeted. And the inquiry? It never asked the right questions. The inquiry into the loss of the Scorpion was never really designed to uncover the truth. It was structured to avoid it. Though filled with experts, data, and testimony, the scope of the questions asked was deliberately narrow. The inquiry was meant to appear thorough while steering clear of anything that could lead to confrontation or political fallout. Crucial information, like the SOSUS recordings, was entirely excluded. Witnesses weren't asked about known Soviet activity in the area. No one mentioned the acoustic signature that pointed to a sudden external explosion. These weren't accidental omissions. They were calculated. The mission of the inquiry wasn't justice. It was containment. The final report offered vague theories, mechanical possibilities, and open-ended speculation, but it never committed to a conclusion. It didn't dare. And for the families of the 99 men aboard the Scorpion, it was devastating. They had waited, hoping for answers, only to be handed ambiguity. They were told their loved ones may have died in a tragic malfunction, a flooding incident, a possible explosion, but nothing was certain. The Navy couldn't or wouldn't tell them more, and so the grief remained unresolved. Behind the curtain, the silence was intentional. Behind the record, the reality was far darker than any official statement would admit. Then came the release of Cold War archives. After years of petitions and mounting public pressure, the veil finally lifted. Thousands of documents that had once been hidden behind walls of national security were now available. The truth, long buried under classified markings, started to emerge. Among these files was a memo from Naval Intelligence. It confirmed that within days of the Scorpion's disappearance, an unknown submarine had been detected dangerously close to the Scorpion's last known position. The contact was later assessed to be foreign and almost certainly hostile. The language in the memo was restrained but clear. The patterns suggested the presence of a submarine consistent with ADVE. Then came the smoking gun, SOSUS data. The recordings showed two distinct underwater events. First, a sharp explosive sound with the energy signature of an external detonation. Second, a low, crushing noise consistent with a submarine hull imploding under pressure. The time between them was just long enough for an attack to breach the hull before the sea crushed it entirely. This wasn't theory. It wasn't speculation. It was physics, math, and raw audio proof. The Navy had known, and they had seen. More files revealed what was found when the wreckage was finally located. Though the public was told it was discovered months after the disappearance, internal ship logs and mission reports revealed that the actual discovery happened far sooner. Naval vessels had quietly deployed to the area. Divers and remotely operated vehicles surveyed the wreck, and what they found only reinforced. Photos and structural analyses showed hull sections blasted outward, not inward, as would be expected from internal pressure failure. The damage was concentrated near the torpedo compartment. The steel was warped and peeled back in a pattern consistent with a high-velocity impact from outside the submarine. Some components were found far from the rest of the wreckage, as though they had been flung outward by a blast wave. Naval engineers privately noted that these patterns could not be explained by a simple battery fire or flooding event. The violence of the damage, its asymmetry, and its proximity to vulnerable areas pointed to one possibility: the Scorpion was hit. And whatever hit it did not come from within. What followed was a slow-burning internal crisis at the highest levels of government. The question was no longer whether the Scorpion had been attacked, but whether the public should be told. Military leaders, intelligence officials, and diplomats debated the consequences. Would admitting the truth provoke retaliation? Would it destabilize already fragile negotiations? Would it invite public fury and demand justice? Ultimately, they decided that the price of truth was too high. The facts were locked away, reports were classified, and the official narrative was shaped. The Scorpion was lost, the cause unknown, investigation ongoing, no signs of foul play, and so the Cold War balance was maintained, not through victory or diplomacy, but through strategic silence. For the families, that silence became another layer of loss. For every unanswered question, there was a document that might have held the answer. For every reassurance given, there was a memo contradicting it. The men they mourned had died in secrecy, and that secrecy had continued long after the sea claimed them. Veterans and sailors who had served with the Scorpion crew began speaking up. They shared stories of tension in the final days before the disappearance. Some remembered whispers of tracking Soviet movements. Others recalled warnings issued and then buried. A few had monitored sonar feeds that hinted at something foreign in the area. Their testimonies, once dismissed or ignored, now aligned with the newly. What emerged was a timeline of events far more coordinated than previously believed. The Scorpion was shadowed. A foreign vessel moved in. Communications spiked, then fell silent. An explosion, an implosion, a vanishing. Everything after that point had been a cover story. The declassified files also revealed the discussions inside the Pentagon, inside the Situation Room, and inside the oval-shaped offices where policy was shaped behind closed doors. The advisors were unanimous in their assessment. Confirmation of a hostile act would mean escalation. Escalation could mean war. War, in a world with nuclear weapons, was unthinkable. So the Scorpion was buried, not just beneath the waves, but beneath layers of bureaucracy, misdirection, and denial. For historians, the release of the files was vindication. For analysts and sonar technicians, it was proof that what they'd suspected for decades had been real. But for the families, it was more complicated. They finally had answers. But those answers only made the silence of the past all the more painful. They had grieved under false assumptions. They had attended ceremonies that honored their loved ones without honoring the truth of how they were lost. They had listened to officials who either didn't know or weren't allowed to say. In the end, the legacy of the Scorpion was shaped not only by its tragic fate, but by the price of concealment. It had become more than just a lost submarine. It was a symbol of Cold War compromise, a reminder that sometimes peace is maintained not by strength or diplomacy, but by decisions made in secret, away from public eyes, and far from the families left behind. What began as a maritime disaster became a political decision, a national security strategy, and a buried chapter in global history. And only now, with the truth finally surfacing, does the full weight of that loss become clear. The Scorpion's fate was never just about a submarine lost at sea. It was about the cost of silence and the decisions made to protect a fragile peace at the expense of truth. After the release of the classified files, one of the most talked-about revelations was the series of high-level debates that unfolded in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. These were not routine damage control meetings. They were intense, urgent, and at times deeply conflicted. Top military officials and national security advisors wrestled with a brutal truth. The Scorpion may have been attacked by a Soviet submarine. The evidence was mounting, but so were the consequences. Admitting that the submarine had been sunk in an act of war would mean confronting the Soviet Union. And that confrontation might not have stayed diplomatic. The fear wasn't just retaliation. It was escalation. Open warfare between two nuclear powers was a line no one wanted to cross. So a choice was made. The truth would be sealed. Publicly, the Navy would continue to explore possible causes. Technicians would speculate on malfunction, electrical failure, or even a rogue torpedo. The term accident would be used often, but never attack. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, any analysis that suggested foreign engagement was quietly marked, stored, and forgotten. Some of the most damning internal memos revealed just how deeply that deception ran. Reports clearly documented acoustic evidence of an explosion consistent with a torpedo strike, followed seconds later by an implosion. Those documents were filed away under top clearance levels, never to be seen by most of the personnel who had been involved in the official inquiry. There were even instructions for how to redirect questions during press briefings. Talking points were issued. Analysts were told to use neutral language. The phrase, "no conclusive cause," became the backbone of every official statement. Meanwhile, back on land, the families of the Scorpion's crew continued to live with uncertainty. They watched grainy news reports. They attended ceremonies. They accepted folded flags and letters of condolence from admirals and presidents, all while unknowingly being kept from the truth. Some of them, over time, began to question the official version. They looked at the inconsistencies. They listened to former sailors and radio men who hinted at what really happened. They pressed for declassification. They demanded clarity. And finally, they got it. But that clarity came with a bitter edge. It wasn't just about knowing what happened. It was about realizing how long the truth had been buried, about understanding that their grief had been politicized, that their pain had been managed, not honored. In interviews that followed the declassifications, several family members spoke openly. They expressed anger, frustration, even betrayal. One widow said, "I lived my whole life thinking it was just an accident. Now I know it was something else and no one ever told me." For the sailors who served in the Cold War era, the story of the Scorpion became a symbol, a cautionary tale about the tension between duty and truth, between national security and moral responsibility. Many of them had long believed something more sinister had happened. Some had carried the burden of classified knowledge for decades. The release of the files lifted that weight, but it also validated their silence. The wreck of the Scorpion still rests on the ocean floor, nearly 10,000 feet down. But its story no longer rests in darkness. What was once hidden in locked rooms, whispered through corridors, and redacted from history books is now out in the open. Historians are re-examining Cold War naval conflicts with new eyes. Scholars are poring through the released files, piecing together the geopolitics of secrecy. And families finally are able to lay their questions to rest, even if the answers are painful. The Scorpion wasn't lost to a random accident. It wasn't a tragic malfunction or an unlucky fire. It was something far more deliberate, and it was silenced to avoid an even greater catastrophe. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest waters. And now, the story of the Scorpion is no longer just a cautionary tale. It's a testimony to the hidden cost of keeping peace, to the sailors who served and died, to the families who waited in vain, and to the idea that some truths, no matter how dangerous, will not stay buried forever. Thank you for watching. What do you think might have happened if this had all come out right away? Would it have changed the course of history or plunged the world into chaos? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out our next deep dive into Cold War secrets finally uncovered. Until next time, stay curious.